Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. I want to welcome you to the National Archives. We're pleased to have you for this special evening with Cokie Roberts and Michael Beschloss. The Foundation is the private partner to the National Archives for all things serious and fun, and tonight I think you'll get a little bit of both. And if you haven't been upstairs during regular business hours, the Spirited Republic exhibition is a little bit of fun and a little bit of serious, with nearly 100 National Archives records that examines the production, consumption, and regulation of alcohol through U.S. history. These are just two examples of initiatives that the Foundation supports, including educational outreach programs, public programs, online resources, family days, sleepovers in the Rotunda, capital projects, and so much more. We help the archives with their mission to make the records more accessible. I know we have a number of Foundation members in the audience tonight and joining us online. Thank you. The Foundation raises support through corporations and foundations and folks like you. And in fact, we know those who are passionate about history and civic literacy are passionate about the Foundation. Last year we had donors from 47 states and the District of Columbia. I won't guilt those 3 states. Okay, if you insist, it was North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. So if you're watching at home, online, I encourage you to go online and join. I personally will send you a special gift from the archive store. We'd love to get those 3 states on board. If you're here tonight and you're not a member yet, you can visit archivesfoundation.org and sign up and enjoy the benefits of membership. And if you are a member, thank you again, but you don't have to stop with your membership. You can visit the archive store upstairs or online at myarchivestore.org. And I'm sure right now, those of you who are here, you can go online, and before Cokie has even come out, you can purchase something to support the National Archives and the Foundation. So with all those public service announcements complete, I now give you our host, who will offer the official archives welcome, our partner, the 10th Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to the Foundation for all the work that you do to support our education, outreach, and exhibit programs. Good evening to all of you here in the William G. McGowan Theater, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on our YouTube channel. Welcome to the National Archives. Tonight we take a look at the contributions of the women of Washington in the years leading up to the Civil War, during the war, and in the few years after the guns fell silent 150 years ago. In her new book, Capital Dames, Cokie Roberts examines the contributions that these formidable women had in holding the Union together. At the same time, these women were changing the place of women in our society, as Cokie will explain in a few moments. Before we move on to tonight's program, I'd like to tell you about 2 other programs coming up soon here in the McGowan Theater. On Thursday, May 7th at 7 p.m., Jonathan D. Sarna will discuss his new book, Lincoln and the Jews, A History, which tells the full story of Lincoln's extraordinary relationship with the Jewish community. Joining him in this conversation will be journalist Stephen Roberts, who is with us this evening right here in the front row. And it's no coincidence that his name is Roberts. And on Tuesday, May 12th at 7 p.m., we'll welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Joseph J. Ellis, who will discuss his new book, The Quartet, Orchestrating the Second American Revolution. The book tells the story of the 4 men most responsible for creating the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. If you want to know more about these and all of our upcoming public programs, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies of the calendar in the lobby, as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive them by regular mail or email. Cokie Roberts is a familiar name around Washington. She's not just because she's married to Steve Roberts. She's a political commentator for ABC News, where she previously co-anchored the ABC Sunday morning show This Week. She's also a contributor to NPR Morning Edition, where she once was congressional correspondent. She's written 3 books about the role of women in American history, all of which were bestsellers. She's been active in the National Archives, in projects at the National Archives for a number of years, and is vice president of the National Archives Foundation. For her book, Capital Dames, The Civil War and the Women of Washington, she looked at the experiences, influence, and contributions of women of Washington, D.C. during this momentous period of American history. Koki drew upon newspaper articles, government records, and private letters and diaries, many never before published, to bring the war-torn capital into focus through the lives of these capital dames. The result is a look at the impact of the Civil War from a very different perspective. Kirkus Reviews calls Capital Dames an enlightening account detailing how the Civil War changed the nation's capital while expanding the role of women in politics, health care, education, and social services. And the Washington Post observed Roberts has uncovered hundreds of personal anecdotes and woven them together in a single suspenseful narrative with great skill. Joining Koki and discussing her new book is presidential historian Michael Beschloss. He is a commentator for NBC News and the PBS NewsHour, as well as a best-selling author and contributing columnist for the New York Times. He's also the author of 9 best-selling books, most of them about John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and other presidents. And he, too, is a vice president of the National Archives Foundation. Now it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Koki Roberts and Michael Beschloss.
Thanks, David. Can everyone hear okay? I guess if you can't reply. Back row? Okay.
He's Michael, I'm Koki.
That's right. Last we checked. Thank you very much, David. And I guess the theme tonight, at least the starting theme, is that we were both vice presidents of the National Archives Foundation.
Which means we don't do the work. Lelia Bundles does the work. She's the president.
She sure does, who is the president. And at least my attitude toward Lelia, Koki, is much more august, is that I feel that I sort of like what, as Koki knows, Eugene McCarthy once said about Hubert Humphrey, that he had the soul of a vice president. I have the soul of a vice president. I offer to park cars and help Lelia up. And Koki is in a much more eminent position than that, and only one of many reasons why we're so thrilled to have her tonight. David has done such a wonderful job of introducing her. It's a little bit like the first Kennedy-Nixon debate. Howard K. Smith said, the candidates need no introduction. Then he went on to introduce both of them, which thanks to David, Koki really needs no introduction tonight. All I can say is that she is one of my favorite people on the planet, one of my favorite authors on the planet. And one thing I sort of missed, I got to be sort of, Koki was in a grand, as she is now, position at ABC News. I was there as a spear carrier years ago. And one of the perks of that job was, as she will confirm, we got to sit together, for instance, on nights like the State of the Union, President's inaugural address. And usually, no one talks during those.
So we had a good time.
Well, we had a good time only because I got to hear what Koki really thought, during the address, sort of commenting on it line by line.
You have to be careful with the microphone.
Right. It was sort of like the director's cut. You could hear her voice along with the voice of the president.
And I was getting the history from Michael, so it was perfect.
Well, I brought in a few dead people. But in any case, I miss those days, and thank you for inviting me tonight.
Oh, thank you for coming tonight and doing this. It's very kind of you.
Well, one of the things I've loved watching with Koki the last number of years is that she not only has continued as a great journalist, but also has now become a great historian. And I know a little bit of this, but probably many people here don't. How did you originally get the instinct to begin turning from not just doing journalism, but also doing history?
Well, dead people, as you know, don't talk back. And that's a great advantage. But
the first law for every biographer.
Which?
I'm going to do a more politically correct version, but really get rid of the widow or widower.
Right. Yeah, right. There you go. Well, even the widows, widowers, all of them are gone too.
Right,
so
right.
It's good. Well, as many as you know, I see some old friends here. My mother, Lindy Boggs, was very involved in politics, behind the scenes, in theory, for many decades. And I saw, growing up here, her and her cronies running everything. You know, they ran the political conventions, the voter registration drives, their husbands' campaigns, their, of course, us kids, and along with the African American women in Washington, all the social service agencies. And so I knew how incredibly influential they were. And of course, for somebody who covers politics in Congress as long as I have, at least, David, thank you for not doing that 40 years in broadcasting thing. But
she started in the cradle.
You get, as you well know the Founding Fathers very well, you know, by first name, and members of the Senate, particularly, but you know, all politicians are always quoting the Founding Fathers, and 99.9% of the time they're wrong. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I go back and read them regularly on, you know, the right to bear arms, the religion in the public square, why you have to be born in America. It turns out you don't have to be born in America. You just have to be born of American parents to be president. You can be born in Canada, for instance. But at any rate, so I got to know them quite well and started wondering what the women of the time were doing, because clearly they must have been at least as influential as the women of my mother's time. And when I went back to learn about them, very little had been written. And so in order to learn about them, I had to research them, and then once I had done that, I might as well write about them. And so I started writing those books, and then just became completely devoted to it. Steve is sweet enough to call it my mission, which makes him nice, because I'm not exactly charming when I'm on deadline, and or lovely.
I wouldn't know what that's like.
But he does understand that it is essentially a mission to bring these women to life and to make their roles known to people, and also not just, I mean, the women's history is particularly important to me, but history is important to me, and we do such a bad job of teaching it by and large that to make it interesting and fun it seems to me to make all the sense in the world, because it's gossip, you know, history's gossip, and gossip's fun, and so the notion that we're all supposed to be sitting around memorizing dates and battles is just silly.
Why did historians leave out women for the first 2.5 centuries that American history was written?
You tell me.
So?
Because they didn't think they were important. And
did it just not turn up in the letters?
It didn't turn up. It's very hard to find the letters. The letters are buried in the men's papers. Most of them have never been transcribed.
That's one of the amazing things about her books, is that she pulls out these things that you would think, you know, these were famous people,
right,
or famous wives so long ago, and oftentimes for the first
time.
Well,
my personal favorite along these lines was when I was writing Ladies of Liberty, which is the period from the inauguration of John Adams to the inauguration of John Quincy Adams. So 1797 to 1825. And in 1820, Louisa Catherine Adams, John Quincy Adams' wife, he was Secretary of State. She is running him for president. She describes it as my vocation to get him elected president. And Abigail Adams had died, and she was writing these chatty, wonderful letters home to old John Adams just to amuse him. And so it was 1820. I'm downstairs in the basement, grandchildren's playroom, because I could spread out a lot of books there, and I'm reading these letters that the Massachusetts Historical Society had been kind enough to send me. At that point, they were just Xeroxing them and sending them. Now they'll scan them. But and I've got this stack of handwritten, Xeroxed 18th century, early 19th century letters, really hard to read. And I start reading this letter, and I can't believe it, because it was the year of the Missouri Compromise, 1820, and because of the compromise, Congress had stayed in session a very long time to hammer out the compromise. And so they finally adjourn. she goes to a meeting of the trustees of the orphan asylum, which Dolly Madison had established after the British invasion. And so she gets there, and one of the other trustees says to her, we're going to need a new building next year. And she says, why? What are you talking about? And the woman says to her, well, the session had been very long, and the fathers, underlined by Louisa, the fathers of the country had left 40 cases behind that would probably require our institution to serve this illicit progeny. 40 pregnant women left behind by the Congress, and there were only a couple of hundred members of Congress, and I mean, some of them might have been recidivist, I don't know, but I went running upstairs to Steve, and I said, read this, and he said, oh my goodness, you know, I mean, but then she said to Adam, she said, I suggest in the next session that Congress should take the $2 additional a day that they have voted themselves as an increase in pay and use it for the establishment of an institution for these foundlings. So, I mean, it doesn't get better than that. But the truth is that those kinds of letters, which tell you a great deal more than just the dates and the battles and the elections, are just hidden. They're just in there. They just haven't been published, haven't been transcribed and published. Now her letters are being published, but for a very long time they were just stuck in his letters. And with this book, the same is true of her daughter-in-law. Mm-hmm. So,
what do you think people like us who are writing about these people of our own period now, what are they going to do 50 years from now without those kind of letters? Yeah. What do you think? I mean,
it's a problem, obviously. For a while, I was feeling pretty good about the fact that emails, even though they're not beautifully written and all of that, do actually tell a family story. Somebody's going off to college, somebody's getting married, somebody's sick, somebody's dying. They're in there, and if you print them out and keep them, you can actually tell a story. But now it's Instagram and all that. Now I suspect if you're subpoenaed, you can get it out of the cloud. But it is a problem. I mean, it is going to be hard.
And even an email, I mean, these letters that you have used in these books, some of them, what's the longest letter that you've found?
Oh, some of them are many pages long.
Sometimes 30 pages
long. I know, but Steve and I wrote a book on marriage a while back, and I quoted a woman who was in a pioneer marriage, and she had moved west in the early 19th century.
Maybe you should explain pioneer marriage. It may not sound to some like what you're...
Oh, she was a pioneer in the West. I see what you mean.
This is not some kinky...
No, right, okay. Never occurred to me, of course. Nice Catholic girl that I am.
No one here but our viewers on YouTube.
So she wrote one day in her diary, she said, was up at 5, baked 9 loaves of bread, taught the Indian children, was delivered of a son. And I think that's a tweet.
Mm-hmm.
So you can still get a lot of information.
I think that probably is a little bit reassuring. And tell a little bit more about the other things that you use aside from letters.
Well,
because you've really gone into, for instance, one thing that I think people forget is that now, as you write about in the book, we can search old newspapers.
Which is so much
it used to be when we all started out, you'd have to go to the Library of Congress, right, and you'd have to but now you can actually quite quickly.
It's one of the great advantages to writing history now as opposed to earlier. Newspapers are online. Yeah. The Library of Congress has a wonderful site funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities called Chronicling America, and it's newspapers from the late 18th century on. And you put in a search of somebody's name or a date, and up comes the story. And it's free. There's a paid one called newspapers.com, which also is very helpful. And these are newspapers from all over the country. Now, a lot of the same stories appeared in newspapers. There was no copyright. Nobody, said.
And once the telegraph started.
And so it would be the same story over and over again.
It never happens now.
No, certainly not. But then the New York Times entire archive is online. And so it's a wonderful resource because, first of all, you're reading what they were reading, so you're in real time. Secondly, much to my surprise, these women were written about, I mean, even when I was growing up, the rule was for a nice lady, you were only in the paper when you were born, married, and died. And these women were in the newspapers, and so that was very interesting. But the third thing is the newspapers are so much fun that you can waste so much time reading them, because all the ads are there, all of that, and it's a lot of fun.
And you oftentimes spend many hours getting
Way
off on
too
things that
many.
have nothing to
Way
do with
too
your
many.
book.
Right,
but
right.
sometimes happens in presidential libraries, too, that you see files that were not directly related to what you were thinking about. So obviously letters and those kind of sources. One thing I've always thought was a huge strength of you as an historian is that you have spent so much of your life here in Washington. You did not obviously live through any of these periods, but to
Almost.
some extent, well, you did, through in your mind and experiencing the sources and thinking and writing about them. But do you find that it is helpful
Yes.
to have grown up in a
Very
famous
much
American political family and have had talk about that?
Yes, very much so. I realized as I was writing the earlier books that one of the things that I could bring to the history was the Washington experience. And so that I understood the politics of the history better than some other historians that I've read. And so when I was contemplating this book, I actually had never intended to write a Civil War book. All of my ancestors fought on the losing side, and it's such an awful war, But the publisher very much wanted a Civil War book, and I'm glad I've done it. But as I was trying to figure out what the book would be, which was hard, I knew it would be about women, but what, And so, as I thought about it, I realized that maybe the Civil War, because it was likely, had had an impact on women's roles that was similar to World War II. Mm-hmm. And it turned out it did. And that's basically the thesis of the book, that it changed women's roles and it changed the role of Washington in American society. But again, if you started to talk about changing women's roles, you can't just do the country. It's way too diffuse. So to focus on Washington then became the most sensible thing to do. But I also feel strongly that it's a place where I can bring a certain strength, and that just understanding what's going on politically, even 150 years ago, is still something that I just get because I get the conversation.
And don't you wonder, like when you go down a street in Washington, wonder what it looked like
yes.
150 years ago?
And that's what's a lot of fun. For those of you who live here, this book's a lot of fun that way, because you'll say, "Oh, 3rd and C,"
The scenes you will know.
Right. So that was a lot of fun. Yeah.
And if you're describing the period 1948 to 1848 to...
I began in 48 for a specific reason, which was that it was the dedication of the Washington Monument.
Yeah, amazing.
And it took a long time for it to get built.
Right.
But at the end of the book, it's still the Washington Monument at 153 feet, but a Matthew Brady picture. But and the reason for that was a moment that harked back to the founding, because Dolly Madison and Eliza Hamilton were there.
Yeah, amazing.
And it is. And Louisa Catherine Adams actually had been on the committee, but she was up in Boston and wasn't there for it. So these women were really a connection, a very living connection to the founders. And so they represented a sense of unity, particularly Dolly Madison, who was such a force in this city. I mean, she really was First Lady for about a half a century. And no, seriously, because of a variety of reasons, there were sort of lame First Ladies. And no, I don't mean it quite that badly, but it's true. And And so, she was such a presence that everybody went to her and called on her, but also sought her advice. And so, she being there, presiding with Eliza Hamilton, really did remind people of why the country was founded and that it had been a unified country fighting the British at a time when the country was beginning to fall apart after the Mexican War, where the addition of all of the new territories had the Congress swords points over what to do in those territories. So that's why it began there. And then she died. Dolly died the next year. And the women of Washington started vying for Chief Belle, and they called themselves Belles, which I love. One of them, a delightful woman named Virginia Clay, who was the wife of an Alabama senator, wrote a book later in life. When she was 75, she wrote a memoir about herself called A Belle of the 50s. So she knew, what her stature was. But so their whole interplay among each other in that period of the decade of the 1850s is really very fascinating.
Because it's really a group biography.
Yes, it is.
As well as being great
Yes.
history. My favorite in the book is Varina Davis.
She's quite
and
something.
Can we start with her and tell her story?
Varina Davis is the wife of Jefferson Davis, and he was a difficult person. That's a nice statement.
You're starting really mild tonight.
She married him as a teenager, which that's the other thing you have to remember about these women. They were so young. And he was in the Senate. She came to Washington as a Senate wife, as a teenager, lived in a boarding house, which was by far the easiest thing to do. Then he goes back home, is back in Mississippi for a while. Then she fights in the Mexican War. He comes back as President Pierce's Secretary of War. And now she's a cabinet wife, right? And they have a couple of little kids. And she really was the foremost hostess in Washington because Pierce's wife was in mourning through the entire presidency. She had already lost 2 children, and on her way to Washington to become First Lady, she sees her only remaining child killed by a train. And so she was just in mourning, and the descriptions are just all that death's head in the White House, like that. But so Varina Davis took on the role, and she was loved by everybody. She was smart, she was funny, but she was incredibly frank. And her letters are just grand to read because she's so frank. And so after the 1856 election, by now Davis is back in the Senate, one of the women who they all loved and admired, who was still a teenager at this point, was Adele Cutts. And she was right in the running for Chief Belle, even though she did not have a powerful man in her life. But her great aunt was Dolly Madison. And so after that election, she married Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois. And Varina Davis was furious. And she says, this well-bred young woman marries this trickster, drunken, man who's got his first wife's money. And she said, and it's just happening because she is poor and her father is proud. And then she says, but fortunately there's a new water system coming to Washington, so perhaps Douglas will wash more often. Because otherwise he will offend her olfactories, and people will have to build larger rooms with more ventilation. So you've got to love that, and on she goes. She and her husband are always having a somewhat tense relationship, but he clearly admires her. That comes through.
Although in this relationship, he certainly is not the compelling figure.
No, he's not anybody you'd want to hang out with. And she's always kind of chafing against the little wife, and she becomes very close friends with the Blairs here, the Blair House Blairs, and at one point they arranged that the Davises can rent a house near them in Oakland, Maryland. And Jefferson Davis writes to his mother-in-law and says, she's gotten the house at a good rate. What they're going to pay me to hang out with the Blairs, I don't know. But then, she goes through the Civil War. She loses a child just like Mary Lincoln. She had lost a child here in a childhood disease. And then in Richmond, her 10-year-old falls off the building and dies. So it was very similar to Mary Lincoln in a lot of ways. And similar to Mary Lincoln, she was suspect by the South, just the way Mary was by the North. Her grandfather, Verena's grandfather, had been the governor of New Jersey, and so that was, suspect. She had gone to school.
To be governor of New Jersey.
Right, because New Jersey was north,
right.
and she had gone to school in Philadelphia. But also she was somewhat olive-complected, and she was not fair enough for a true Southern belle. And she got heat about that. Finally, the war's over. Jefferson Davis is in prison. She gets him out. They have a troubled time. They're separated at times, finally together. Finally, he dies. Phew. And
this is the author speaking.
and she moves to New York. And the South goes crazy. The First Lady of the Confederacy moving to New York. This is horrible. They offer her a house in Richmond. She says, no, I'm going to New York. It's where I can make a living. She needed to make a living. She was writing for the New York World newspaper. But she wrote to her daughter with all this. The newspapers were all writing about how terrible it was. She wrote to her daughter and she said, I am free, brown, and 64. I can do whatever I want to do. So she then did move to New York, and she did write for the newspaper, but she also ran a salon. Anybody who knew her always talked about what a wonderful conversationalist she was. But she befriended Julia Grant, the wife of Ulysses S. Grant, and that turned out to be page one news in all of the newspapers when the two of them met. And both of them, but particularly Verena Davis, because Julia Grant's really nice, but not the brightest bulb. And but they understood that what they were doing was affecting reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And she went very purposefully to the dedication of the Grant Memorial, Verena Davis did, so that the world would see the First Lady of the Confederacy going to the dedication of the Union Generals and Presidents Memorial. And there was a lot of that after the war among these women, of them trying to bring the country back together.
And knowing that they had an important role.
They had a role to play when everybody else was in the South was still, weeping about the lost cause.
Right. You show us a different Mary Todd Lincoln. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's hard to, Mary Todd Lincoln. She's hard. Didn't you try to write about Mary Todd Lincoln and get very depressed at some point? Yeah. Yes, I saw.
It's not an irrational response.
So, she is bipolar, I guess, would be the modern diagnosis. Clearly, it's a love affair between the Lincolns. That's clearly the case. And she's smart, and she understands him in all kinds of ways, but she's really difficult. And she has a temper, and she has views, and she expresses them. And so people don't like that because she says what she thinks about cabinet members who she doesn't like and all of that.
Which is wonderful for the historian.
It is. It's wonderful that she said all that, yes. But, again, so she was accused of leaking the president's State of the Union message to the New York Herald on the theory.
For money.
Either for money or for good coverage. Because her coverage was bad. Every time she'd go to New York, the entire press corps would land on her and watch everything she bought, which was a lot. Mm-hmm. But they were all over her. I mean, it looks like, some other First Lady that we've seen recently. And she was accused of leaking the State of the Union message, and there was a congressional investigation into the First Lady's communication, and the president had to go up to the Hill and say, please don't do this. Don't embarrass me by subpoenaing the First Lady. And so a lot of things don't change.
Do you think she had as large a sense of her role as Verena Davis did after the war?
No, after the war, she was a mess. Yeah. She stayed in the White House for a few months after Lincoln was killed. Now she was sitting next to him in the theater we were talking about earlier, and that would be a shock of major proportions
for someone who was fragile
to begin with. And in fact, when her half-sister came, this was one of these odd moments where her half-sister's husband was a Confederate officer who had been killed in the war, and she came and stayed at the White House. So there's a Confederate widow in the Lincoln White House. And that woman's daughter wrote a book about Mary Lincoln, quoting her mother's diary from that period. And Emily Helm was her name. And in the diary, Mrs. Helm was talking about how mentally off balance Mary Lincoln was, and that President Lincoln even said that to her, and took
her to the window. And
that was Elizabeth Keckley telling us that, who we should talk about. But
that's my
Emily Helm said that the president said, how worried he was about her mental state, and she herself judged the half sister, if anything happens to him, meaning Abraham, or Tad, she will go off the deep end. And of course it did.
Both.
Yeah.
Indeed. I was going to ask later, but we've gotten to Elizabeth Keckley, so tell us who she was.
Well, Elizabeth Keckley was one of the most interesting people you'd ever want to read about. She was a slave who bought her freedom. At the time when she bought her freedom, she was in St. Louis. She moved to Baltimore to try to teach African American women to sew and to make a living. That didn't work out for her, so she moved here. And she was a highly, highly accomplished dressmaker, a couturier. And she started sewing for Verena Davis and Elizabeth Blair Lee and all of the prominent women. And then when Mary Lincoln moved to town, she wanted to hire the best. And so Elizabeth Keckley started sewing for her, and they became confidants. Really, Mrs. Keckley was really Mrs. Lincoln's best friend. And she took care of Willie when he was sick, and then and dealt with him after his body after he died. She took care of Mrs. Lincoln after the president was killed, went to Illinois with her, all of that, and then wrote a tell-all. And just, again, things don't change.
Right.
And so that book ruptured the relationship with Mary Lincoln completely. And it also really pretty much ruined Mrs. Keckley's business, because the people she sewed for were worried she might write about them, and the African Americans thought she had betrayed Lincoln. And so she had trouble keeping her business going. She did teach for a while at Wilberforce University, but her big mission in life was to help the freed slaves. And it started when enslaved people started showing up here before the emancipation. And she started a contraband society. And because she had such influential patrons, she was able to raise a good deal of money and get their support. And so she was really able to help enormously the thousands of enslaved people arriving in Washington. And then after emancipation, it became a freedmen's society. And so she was a real social reformer as well.
And a much larger figure than people knew for most of
Right,
history.
and the truth is, it's interesting, of the women I write about, because she was black, she was barely black, she was about my color, but she was the only one who I could not find an obituary for.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Incredible. Clara Barton is another example of someone we thought we knew, but when you read Coky's book, I think you'll feel that you don't. So.
Well, this is one of the things that drives me crazy about history books. It's kind of, and then she founded the Red Cross.
Right.
Really, was it hard? Did something go before that? But she was raised in a New England family with a mother who was a suffragist and an abolitionist, and she taught, and she was always railing against the fact that she often made less than men. So she was aware of that and talking about it in the 1840s. And then she came to Washington to make a living. She worked at the patent office. And when the war started, the Massachusetts troops started arriving, and so she started helping them out, and then some of them had been people she had taught. And they wrote home and said, there's this great woman here who's, collecting supplies for us. So everybody started sending her stuff for the troops. She ended up with 3 warehouses full of supplies. And so she went to the quartermaster general and said, I can help. I've got 3 warehouses full. So he gave her permission to go to the front. And she then started nursing, bringing supplies constantly, but also nursing in some of the worst battles that were fought, particularly Antietam, where she was on the field for days and just, seeing horrendous things, but was very well respected for it. And then when the war was over, she started the Missing Persons Bureau, and really was the person who was able to find the people who couldn't be found. She would go to regiments and put ads in newspapers of their towns, and then people would write to her from those newspapers about, I saw him in X place, that kind of thing. The archives was very helpful in some of Clara Barton's documents. But then she went to Europe, and she also marked tens of thousands of graves that had been unmarked graves, particularly at Andersonville, the horrendous Confederate prison. But then after the war, she went to Europe and discovered something called the Red Cross, and came home and established the American Red Cross. But in order to unite with the International Red Cross, the United States had to ratify the Geneva Conventions. Same Geneva Conventions we're talking about today. And she worked for 2 decades lobbying the Congress until they finally did ratify the conventions. And then she got inserted into them what was called the American Amendment, which says that the Red Cross can go to natural disasters as well as onto battlefields. So that's how that all happened. So when you read about a flood someplace where the Red Cross is there, that's all her doing.
You were mentioning Julia Grant, who President Lincoln was assassinated 150 years ago.
Last week.
She had a role in that evening. Mention what that was and talk a little bit more about her.
Well, she had been invited to the theater. The Grants had been invited to the theater to sit in the box with the Lincolns. But Mrs. Grant had reason not to like Mrs. Lincoln. Mrs. Lincoln kept giving people reasons not to like her.
And how many people declined the invitation?
The number of people they asked to go to the theater with them was huge. And they finally ended up with this, couple that was
they
just
barely knew,
and right, yeah. Exactly. Will you please come with us, And so, but Julia Grant had been down at the Union headquarters at City Point, the port outside of Richmond, and Mary Lincoln had come down to visit with the president, come down to visit the troops, and had been just incredibly rude to Julia Grant, just viciously rude. And
what was it that bothered her most?
Well, what always bothered Mary Lincoln was that she thought that another woman got the president's eye, or was sitting next to the president on a horse, or and in this case it was a horse, and she and Mrs. Grant had taken an ambulance to the parade grounds where they were going to see the troops marching in review. And when she got there, one of the general's wives was on a horse next to the president, and she just had a fit. And she had a fit with the woman, she had a fit with the president, she had a fit with Mrs. Grant, she just had a total fit. And then when she came back, after Richmond was liberated, or whatever fell, She didn't invite Mrs. Grant to join her when she went into Richmond, and then she had a party, and they were on boats next to each other in the river, in the James River, and she didn't invite Mrs. Grant to the party. Mrs. Grant then had the Marine Band come on her ship and drove and had to go up and down by Mrs. Lincoln's and play "You'll Miss Me When I'm Gone" or something. And this we all know from Mrs. Grant's writings.
Right,
and her book, by the way, she wrote this book of memoirs, which she could not find a publisher for. It was not published until 1975, Julia Grant, because nobody thought she was important.
It's an example of just what
exactly.
you're talking about.
And it's a delightful book. But at any rate, she tells in the book, Mary Lincoln summons them to the theater. And she says to her husband, "I'm not going, we're going home," because she hadn't seen her children in months, and they were at school in New Jersey. And she said, "We're going home to see the children." And Grant said, "Well, maybe later." She said, No, we're actually going home to see the children." And she was clear that she was very insistent on it. And but then she had a whole sort of series of events during the day that were quite peculiar, and she came to believe quite strongly that this was the assassin assigned to Grant, who was supposed, because Grant was supposed to be assassinated as well, and that they had literally dodged the bullet by going home to the children.
Indeed. We mentioned Elizabeth Blair Lee in passing, but let's hear a little bit more.
Well, she's the Blair of Blair House here in Washington. Of course, we all know her father, Francis Preston Blair, had been originally a confidant of Andrew Jackson, and a newspaper man in the Jackson administration. In fact, she was such a favorite of President Jackson's that he gave her his wife Rachel's wedding ring. And she and Jessie Benton at the time, Thomas Hart Benton's daughter, really grew up together in the Jackson White House. The saying was they grew up in caucus. And then when Lincoln's president, her father is a confidant of the president. Her brother, Montgomery Blair, is in the cabinet. Her other brother, Frank Blair, is in the Congress from Missouri. And her husband, Phillips Lee, who was Robert E. Lee's cousin, was in the Union Navy. And because he was in the Navy, she wrote to him pretty much every day. And so there are thousands of letters. Hundreds of which have been published. The wartime letters have been published, but the rest are at Princeton and findable. And she writes such an interesting description of everything that's going on in Washington. She's politically very involved and astute, but she's also a good reporter. And so she's telling us, because one of the things that really I had not thought about or understood was what incredible danger the city was in, particularly at the beginning of the war. Sure. I mean, there was Virginia right across the river, and Maryland was iffy about whether it would secede or not. And
dangers on Lincoln's inaugural
right,
day.
all of that. And even after Maryland stayed in the Union, there were plenty of Confederate sympathizers. And so it was dicey until a series of forts were built around the city. And even then, there were a couple of times when both she and a couple of other women wrote, if the Confederates decide to come in, nobody's going to stop them because the Union Army was all elsewhere. So she gives a very strong sense of that, and a couple of times did have to leave for safety. But she also really does a play-by-play. And so you get a very good sense of what's happening both in terms of the war and politically. And there are moments, what's wonderful about these letters, first of all, women's letters are just better. They just are. Men's letters, particularly famous men, they think about them, they edit them, they think they're going to be published, they're pompous, and the women's letters are just frank and funny and fresh and alive, and also they're details that just so get your attention. And in one of her letters, she talks about a young man who they buried that day, had been killed in the war, and she said, and today was supposed to be his wedding day. And you just get, goosebumps thinking about it. And those kinds of details really tell you a great deal. She was also, for 50 years, director of the orphan asylum, which is still here. Hillcrest is the orphan asylum that Dolly Madison founded in 1814.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm going to ask one or two questions, but anyone from the audience who has a question for Cokie in about 3 or 4 minutes, I will mention when the time comes, but please keep what you would like to ask in mind, and when the time comes, please come up to either microphone on either side.
I do want to just tell you about one more set of letters, which was Abigail Brooks Adams. And these letters have never been published either. And she was Charles Francis Adams' wife, so John Quincy's son. And he was in Congress for one term, but it was the notorious 36th Congress that seceded from the Union. And
You had to have someone there for the term.
Right, and that's right. And he then went on to London to be the Union ambassador to the court of St. James and was highly instrumental in keeping the British from allying with the Confederacy. But she was right in the tradition of her mother-in-law and grandmother-in-law of being a very frank woman with strong views. And her letters were home to Henry Adams, her son. And she writes, Buchanan is a toad. And she also wrote, the Senate is acting like children, and silly ones at that. I mean, you can totally get behind that. And but my favorite was that she said, I would advise any woman, any young woman who wants to have a quiet, peaceful life, not to marry an Adams.
Since you mentioned Buchanan, this is the last name I'll ask about, Harriet Lane.
Well, Harriet Lane was James Buchanan's niece. She was orphaned when she was about 11 years old and asked to live with her uncle, James Buchanan. And so he raised her. She came here to visitation, and a lot of these women went to visitation. It educated women of all faiths and from both North and South, and actually, remarkably, Southern women stayed there during the war, unlike at Georgetown, for instance. The Union never took over the school, which they did pretty much every school and every church and every hotel, for either barracks or hospitals. But they didn't take over visitation because Winfield Scott's daughter had become a nun and was buried there. And he still had enough clout to say, you're not taking my daughter to school. And so she went to visitation as a girl, and he was at that point Secretary of State, and her uncle. And she would come into this, she would leave the boarding school and come be with him on Sundays and learn a lot about politics and all of that. And then he became ambassador to the court of St. James, and she went with him to London, and she was highly regarded, mainly by Queen Victoria, who named her an honorary ambassadress, and her friends kept advising her to marry in England because she was going to come home and not find somebody here, and that actually turned out to be pretty much true. And so she came back, and she was the first lady in the Buchanan administration. And she's the first person for whom the term first lady was applied in the press. So that was, and she was.
It was not a wife.
It was not a wife,
Yeah.
and she was pretty well regarded by most of the women here. Some of them thought she was a little too cold and proper.
It's a criticism you never hear about
Right.
any first lady.
She just wasn't fun, but she did everything she was supposed to do. And then during the war, she had a miserable time because Buchanan was so appropriately vilified. And then she late in life, or late for the time, married a man from Baltimore and moved there and became very interested in poor children in Baltimore. She had 2 boys. They died in successive years as teenagers, and then her husband died. And she established a hospital for Poor Children in Baltimore, which is now the Harriet Lane Children's Clinic of Johns Hopkins University. And then she moved here, back to Washington, where she had really been happiest. And when Theodore Roosevelt became president, she did a lot of the entertaining at the White House. He called on her to do that. But she also had said the whole time she had been in the White House as First Lady, she had been lobbying for, and these women lobbied constantly, and she had been lobbying for a National Gallery of Art and helped establish kind of a lobbying group, an association that would try to get a National Gallery of Art. She did not succeed in her life, but she left her art collection to the Smithsonian, which determined that in its charter an art gallery was called for. So the National Gallery of Art really did start as a result of Harriet Lane.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful bequest. Last two quick questions, then before we go to the audience. Of the women, and these are very strong women, and in the course of what they were doing, in many cases you can see them expanding opportunities for women, particularly in professional life. But of all the women that you've got in this book, who do you think consciously said to herself, that's part of my mission? I think that women are underused and should have a different role in American life.
They didn't really think that way. Clara Barton, more than anybody, would have thought that way, but she couldn't get along with other women well, so she thought it in theory, but she didn't do it in practice. It really just wasn't in their consciousness as something that they wrote about or talked about. But after the war, what you did start to see was that they became suffragists, and
almost naturally.
Exactly, that they had seen what the war had wrought, and they felt strongly that they needed to be involved, and that women needed to have much more say in government because the men weren't doing a very good job of it.
Which they weren't.
Right. So.
And final question, the flip side of this, of the men you deal with in the book, which of them is highest on the Cokie-Roberts scale of knowing that women are so smart?
It's actually interesting. I've never really liked any of the men. No, I mean, I admire Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and George Washington, but I don't like them. I like Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. I really do. And
on this issue, too.
And I didn't know him until I started writing this book, and I really came away liking him a lot. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, on that note, I assume that Cokie has provoked at least one or two queries.
Microphones and people, and the only reason we really request that you go to the microphones is because this is the archives, and we keep records, and so in order to have
not the NSA, they don't keep records over there.
So in order to have a record on tape, we need you to be at the microphones.
That's good.
As an historian, which woman do you think should be on the $20 bill?
So as I understand it, there's like a narrow list from which to choose, and I don't understand who made up the list. Why did that happen? Why don't we get to vote?
Well, if you could choose without regard to any limits.
Well, it's hard to say. I suppose, actually my first answer to this question was Dolly Madison, and people got very upset because, she's a wife. I thought she made a lot of sense. But I suppose the suffragists would be the women that, was kind of the prominent suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But of course we have a Susan B. Anthony dollar. Nobody uses it. It's you could certainly make a case for Abigail Adams because of her writings about women and rights. Mercy Otis Warren. There are people you can make a case for. But are they of the stature of Hamilton, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln? Yes, probably Jackson. That's why the 20 is. That's why the 20 is the aim. But but it is, it is a problem because women were not allowed to be in those roles.
Yeah, obviously, Civil War is.
John.
Yeah, good to see you. Civil War is a major event in this era. How did the role of women in war differ in this era than in the other eras you wrote about in your previous books?
Well, what interested me was how similar it was. That was what I was kind of looking for and found. So that, we've now been educated, thankfully, partly because of the archives, of the role of Rosie the Riveter and her sisters in World War II, and the government girls who came into Washington in droves as the bureaucracy expanded to deal with the wars, and those women were there in the Civil War, which was interesting, very interesting to me. So we had, women working in the arsenals in Rosie the Riveter type jobs, and here in Washington there was a horrendous arsenal explosion, which killed a couple of dozen young women, and the newspaper accounts are just awful. And they're talking about these charred bodies where you can't recognize them, and that they are trapped in their hoop skirts, because they had to dress properly to go stuff cartridges, for ammunition. And then government girls arrived by the hundreds, and they arrived mainly to make a living, but they came just as Congress passed legislation allowing for the printing of paper money to pay for the war. And the money then, as now, comes off the printing press in these huge sheets. Of course, now it's cut up by machines. Then you sat and cut out each bill with scissors. And the Treasurer of the United States, General Skinner, said, women are better with scissors than men are. And so he hired them by the hundreds. He also said you can pay them less, something NPR certainly understood. And so those similarities very much interested me. And then seeing the change in attitude among the women who had been the political women before the war, who had been very interested in politics and had gone to the Capitol all the time and listened to all the debates and commented on them and helped their husbands with speeches and letters and all of that. After the war, they stood on the stage themselves and militated for suffrage or became journalists or became social service organizers. So they went from behind the scenes to the scenes. And so I thought that was very similar to World War II. And the suffrage piece was similar to after World War II. That is when you started to get the Equal Rights Amendment piece. That was introduced immediately after World War II. So the suffrage part was very correlated with that, I thought.
Fascinating.
Yes, I was interested to hear you say that Lincoln is your favorite president. I'm a Southerner with a South Carolina grandmother who refused to hear his name in her presence.
I'm
one
from
of the
Louisiana.
reasons why was because he made vicious war on women and children deliberately with the idea of breaking the spirit of the South and the women in particular. And that was just not the code of war as it should have been.
I was raised that way too, but it's just not true.
Well, please expatiate.
I totally was raised with all of that, and also where everybody hid the silver. Why the Yankees never caught on that the silver was always in those fan windows, I don't know. But I mean, I say in the book, my great grandfather. When I go to my mother's grave, there is my great grandfather's grave, and it says CSA. Confederate States of America. My father's great uncle was a general, a Confederate general who didn't surrender till 6 weeks after Appomattox, the Army of Trans-Mississippi. And so, I was raised the way your grandmother raised you, but it's just not true. And the truth is that the war fought in the South was, first of all, most of it was in Virginia and to some degree in Pennsylvania. I mean, and then there were the western fronts, but the Deep South really didn't have much of the war. South Carolina barely saw the war, and until Sherman's army came back up, and then he was bad in South Carolina because South Carolina had been the state to secede. But you know what was the most ravaged city in the war? It was Richmond, and it was done by the Confederates as they left.
Well, they burned it, but that doesn't answer the question why you admire Lincoln.
Because
sorry,
I'm sorry, I disagree with your premise that he waged a war against women and children.
He said that.
He didn't say that.
Well, we have to disagree with that. But in fact, it did happen, as you know. But I want to know what you admire.
Okay, I think we've got it.
My family comes on both sides from Richmond, too. I'm a thorough Virginian, except for a little South Carolina. And I can tell you it was bad.
Of course it was bad, but what was really bad
But why do you admire Lincoln? That is the question.
Tell you what, come to the signing, buy 10 books, and then she will tell you why she... Thank you very much.
I mean, from my perspective, the really, really bad thing was the South seceding. The South was a prosperous part of the country that could have eventually figured its way to freeing the slaves, which had to happen for moral reasons as well as economic ones and every kind of reason on earth. And instead, they made this dumb decision which impoverished the South and killed tens of thousands of people. And the bad part was they were starving in the South because they didn't have the wherewithal to exist without the rest of the country.
You've talked a lot about women that have had a huge impact or whatever, but maybe one of the characters from D.C. in the Civil War is a little bit more infamous, Mary Surratt. What is your sort of opinion on her, and how do you think that her execution maybe changed the way that the city viewed women or the country?
I don't think that her execution changed the way people viewed women. It was the first execution of a woman by the federal government, and I think she was innocent. But I don't think it had an effect in terms of how people viewed women. She was by far the person who got the most coverage because she was a woman, and people who went to the trial were fascinated by her. And she would sort of look straight. She wore a veil, and she would try to look straight forward and all that. And then when she came out to be hanged, she was the first one they brought to the gallows, and there was a tremendous kind of fascinating. It was like celebrity gossip.
Ghoulish.
It was ghoulish and interesting to people. Adele Cutts Douglas tried at the last minute to get Andrew Johnson to pardon her. People were amazed that she was hanged, and everyone assumed she would not be. And Johnson just absolutely refused. And Adele Cutts went right by bayonets to get to Johnson and say, you've got to pardon her, and he just wouldn't hear it. She got a lot of other people pardoned, but she didn't get Mary Surratt pardoned.
Indeed. Anyway, the book is Capital Dames. Thank you, Cokie.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
You've only heard 100th of what's in it. Thank you again, Cokie. There's a signing right now outside. As I said, I recommend that everyone here buy 10 copies, read it 10 times. Thank you again.
Thank you, Michael.